Why Ford B is the key to understanding Custer's last stand amid the vast and tragic saga of Custer's last stand. One critical element has often been overshadowed: the strategic crossing known as Ford B. While many accounts focus on the chaotic and brutal final moments of George Armstrong Custer's defeat, few examine the pivotal decisions made at this shallow crossing of the Little Bighorn River. It was on the bluffs above Ford B where Custer's fate may have been sealed, not through a dramatic cavalry charge or a desperate final stand, but through the critical choices he made as he surveyed the river, weighing the immense risks of advancing into enemy territory. The events that unfolded at Ford B are crucial to unraveling the complexity of Custer's strategy, a place where reconnaissance, retreat, and fatal miscalculation intersected, casting a long shadow over history. At the height of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as General Custer and his cavalry ascended to the top of what is now known as Loose Ridge, the decisions he made in those fleeting moments were shaped by what he could observe from this critical vantage point. Below him, the expanse of the Little Bighorn Valley stretched out, with the sprawling Sioux and Cheyenne village visible in the distance. Just beyond lay the shallow crossing known as Ford B, where Custer would soon confront the most decisive moment of the battle. At this point of opportunity and peril, his fate began to take shape, driven by choices that remain hotly debated to this day. His next move, shrouded in uncertainty and controversy, would either lead his command to triumph or, as history records, to utter annihilation. The historical account of Custer's last stand has long been mired in speculation, clouded by conflicting testimonies and elusive details. For over a century, historians, researchers, and eyewitnesses have grappled with one central question: what was Custer's true intent upon reaching Loose Ridge? Was he conducting a reconnaissance mission to assess the village's defenses, or did he fully intend to cross the river and launch an all-out assault? Even among those present during the battle, opinions varied. As Custer stood on the ridgeline, the exact path he would take and his ultimate objective remained uncertain. From the very first hours after the battle's disastrous conclusion, confusion reigned, and every new account seemed to introduce a fresh layer of ambiguity. While the movements of Custer's command can be traced with relative clarity to certain key landmarks, such as Loose Ridge and Nye Cartwright Ridge, his precise route beyond these points remains a subject of intense debate. The grim finality of his command's fate is well documented, but the decisions leading up to it, whether he hesitated, backtracked, or pressed forward into catastrophe, continue to be scrutinized. The testimony of Major Frederick Benteen, one of Custer's subordinates, only deepened the uncertainty. In a letter dated July 4th, 1876, just days after the battle, Benteen wrote to his wife, reflecting on the catastrophe. The latest and probably correct account of the battle is that none of Custer's command entered the village at all. Yet, even within the same letter, Benteen's opinion wavered. Earlier, he had written, "I am of the opinion that nearly, if not all, of the 5 companies got into the village but were driven out immediately." This inconsistency captured the essence of the confusion surrounding Custer's actions and the difficulty in reconstructing an accurate account. Years later, during the Reno Inquiry in 1879, Benteen's stance shifted once again. He initially believed that Custer had moved down toward Ford B, but he later concluded that Custer had never reached the crossing at all. Instead, Benteen theorized that Custer bypassed Ford B entirely, cutting directly across Loose and Nye Cartwright Ridges. As time passed, Benteen's testimony became increasingly resolute. In an 1892 letter to Edward Golden, he expressed agreement with Captain Edward Godfrey's theory regarding Custer's movements. Godfrey, in contrast to Benteen's evolving perspective, was steadfast in his belief that Custer had indeed attempted to cross the river at Ford B. This divergence between two experienced military officers mirrored the broader uncertainty surrounding the battle. Benteen's conflicting statements, Godfrey's unwavering conviction in a river crossing, and the absence of clear evidence of combat at Ford B further complicated historians' efforts to reconstruct events. Adding to the ambiguity, A theory emerged during the Reno inquiry that the tracks observed at Ford B may not have belonged to Custer's troops at all, but rather to native warriors who had driven captured cavalry horses across the river. This possibility is plausible, but it is equally likely that any tracks left by Custer's men were erased by the movement of native forces following the annihilation of his command. The confusion surrounding Custer's actions extended far beyond the military officers who sought to piece together the battle's events. Even Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who fought at the Little Bighorn provided accounts that varied significantly. In 1886, Captain Godfrey walked the battlefield alongside Gall, a prominent Hunkpapa Lakota chief who had fought against Custer. During their discussion, Gall indicated what he believed to be Custer's trail. For Godfrey, this was a revelation, he later recalled. It then flashed upon me that I myself had seen Custer's trail on June 28th while we were burying the dead. I asked Major Reno for permission to ascend the high ridge east of the battlefield to look for tracks of shod horses, hoping to determine whether any of the command might have escaped. When I reached the ridge, I saw this trail and wondered who could have made it. At the time, Godfrey dismissed the idea that these tracks belonged to Custer's column, as they did not align with the prevailing theory that he had attempted to cross at Ford B. The trail appeared too far back and did not lead toward the ford, conflicting with the assumption of a direct assault on the village. However, this discovery introduced further uncertainty. Even Gall himself, though deeply involved in the battle, may not have directly witnessed Custer's movements. Based on reconstructed timelines, Gall and fellow warrior Iron Cedar departed from the bluffs at approximately 2:29 p.m. Just minutes before Custer began his ascent of Loose Ridge at 2:32 p.m. Gall did not reach the village until around 2:39 p.m., coinciding with Custer's arrival at the top of Loose Ridge. From Gall's perspective, it would have been impossible to observe Custer's actions firsthand at that critical moment. He and his warriors gathered reinforcements before heading toward Ford B, but they did not arrive until approximately 3:09 p.m., shortly after Custer had already left the area. As Custer stood atop Loose Ridge, he faced a defining choice: advance northward, push toward the river, or attempt a more audacious maneuver. The tracks leading toward the final battlefield suggest that some elements of his command moved in that direction, while other trails, leading back into Medicine Tail, Coulee, or toward the river, may have been erased by subsequent native movements. Godfrey's reflections on Custer's trail lend weight to the theory that Custer may have approached Ford B only as part of a reconnaissance effort, rather than a full-scale attack. Many surviving officers of the 7th Cavalry found it difficult to believe that Custer would have attempted to cross the river with so much of his command still spread out behind him. Ultimately, the uncertainties remain. Benteen's shifting perspectives, the lack of significant cavalry horse casualties at Ford B, and the unresolved mystery of the shod tracks all contribute to the enigma surrounding Custer's final moments. Even today, Custer's last stand remains a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a moment frozen in history, yet forever debated. The enigma of Custer's approach to Ford B. Gall's movements closely coincided with Custer's advance through Medicine Tail, Coulee, as he ascended the slope of the second ridge. Captain Edward Godfrey's detailed description of these events aligns with the timing and positioning of Custer's command, yet it leaves many crucial questions unanswered. While military accounts paint a complex and often contradictory picture, the testimonies of Native American warriors add further layers of intrigue. One such account comes from Shave Elk, an Oglala warrior, who claimed that he and another warrior crossed the Little Bighorn River at Medicine Tail Ford and spotted Custer's column advancing toward them. Alarmed, they swiftly rode back down Medicine Tail, Coulee, recrossed the river, and alerted the village of the soldiers' approach. According to Shave Elk, Custer's men descended the Coulee toward the river, halted briefly, and were soon engaged by attacking warriors. He noted that a few soldiers were ahead of the main body, suggesting an initial scouting effort or skirmish. However, Shave Elk's account appears to compress time, describing a chase that likely never occurred, as Custer's command was not pursued in this manner. His portrayal may reflect the heightened emotions of the moment or a simplified retelling of events. Nevertheless, his testimony supports the broader conclusion that Custer's troops approached the river but never successfully crossed it. Other native warriors provided similar, yet slightly differing, recollections. Standing Bear, a Mini-Kanju Lakota warrior, recounted seeing Custer's column raising dust as it neared the village. In a 1907 interview with Judge Eli Ricker, Standing Bear stated, "Custer came down the ridge across the creek, the second or rear ridge from the river. He made no known attempt to reach the river to cross." Flying Hawk, an Oglala Lakota warrior, echoed this sentiment, emphasizing that Custer halted on high ground above the village rather than pressing toward the riverbank. Their accounts reinforced the notion that Custer's movements were cautious, marked more by observation than immediate aggression. The testimonies of warriors such as Shave Elk, Standing Bear, and Flying Hawk serve as valuable pieces in the puzzle of Custer's movements, though they fail to establish a clear consensus. Some narratives suggest that Custer paused near the river, while others maintain that he remained on the ridges. These discrepancies, compounded by the passage of time and the oral tradition through which many of these accounts were preserved, make definitive conclusions elusive. What remains clear, however, is that Custer's approach to Ford B was not a reckless charge, but a calculated reconnaissance effort. As Godfrey later observed, it seemed highly improbable that Custer would have committed to a river crossing while much of his command remained scattered across the ridges behind him. The lack of significant cavalry casualties near the ford, coupled with the inconclusive evidence of shod horse tracks, further deepens the mystery surrounding his intentions. The enduring debate over Custer's final decisions, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was a chaotic and fast-moving engagement, and Custer's actions have remained a focal point of historical debate for generations. The conflicting testimonies from both military officers and native warriors illustrate the difficulty of reconstructing his precise route and objectives. From Loose Ridge to the heights near Ford B, the movement of Custer's command remains an enigma, one shaped by speculation, competing narratives, and the tragedy that would soon unfold. For over a century, historians and military analysts have struggled to understand what motivated Custer's decisions that fateful day. Did he intend to conduct reconnaissance, or was he preparing for an aggressive assault on the village? Theories abound, some casting him as a doomed leader fated for disaster, while others attempt to reconstruct his tactical mindset as he surveyed the battlefield from the bluffs overlooking Ford B. One enduring theory posits that Custer planned to cross Ford B in a bold, sweeping attack on the village. Supporters of this idea argue that surprise was his only viable strategy. If he wished to seize control of the village, he needed to strike quickly and decisively. However, closer examination of the battlefield's timeline and terrain challenges this interpretation. The logistical difficulties of maneuvering cavalry across the river, combined with the dispersed nature of his forces, suggest that his approach was more likely a scouting effort rather than an immediate offensive maneuver. Another theory, famously proposed by archaeologist Richard Fox, takes a more fatalistic view. It suggests that Custer, intent on launching a surprise attack, rode directly toward Ford B, only to be met by an overwhelming ambush from native warriors lying in wait. This dramatic scenario aligns with popular depictions of Custer's last stand, but unravels under scrutiny. A major flaw in the ambush theory is the lack of physical evidence supporting the notion of a large-scale attack at Ford B. Additionally, the timeline does not support a sudden and overwhelming assault at the ford. Custer arrived at the bluffs overlooking Ford B around 2:55 p.m., assessed the situation for roughly 10 minutes, and began moving away from the crossing at approximately 3:05 p.m. If he had been routed by a massive ambush, his command would likely have collapsed far earlier in the engagement. The fact that fighting continued until after 5 p.m. suggests that his men were not immediately overwhelmed, but instead engaged in a series of running skirmishes as they retreated northward. Testimonies from native warriors also conflict with the ambush theory. While some accounts describe skirmishes at Ford B, none support the idea of a large-scale trap. Cheyenne warrior waterman later told Colonel Tim McCoy that Custer's men attempted to cross the river but were driven back. However, Waterman's description implies a minor engagement rather than a decisive rout. Similarly, Northern Cheyenne warrior Brave Wolf recalled that Custer's soldiers neared the river but never crossed, again indicating that whatever fighting occurred at Ford B was brief and not catastrophic. Further evidence contradicting the ambush theory lies in the battlefield's layout and the distribution of fallen soldiers. If Custer's command had been crushed at Ford B, more bodies would have been found in that area. Instead, the majority of his men were discovered further north, scattered along the ridges leading to Calhoun Hill and beyond. This suggests that Custer's forces withdrew from Ford B in an orderly fashion rather than in a chaotic retreat caused by an ambush. Even among military officers who studied the battle and its aftermath, the ambush theory had its skeptics. One of Custer's former West Point classmates, General Thomas Rosser, dismissed the notion outright, calling it too silly to be discussed. Rosser pointed out that if Custer had been repulsed at Ford B, his column would have been driven back along its original path rather than pushed northward toward Calhoun Hill. This argument challenges the idea that Custer was caught off guard and instead supports the interpretation that he left Ford B of his own volition, consistent with his tactical reasoning. Custer's mindset, a calculated gamble? Understanding Custer's actions requires acknowledging his experience as a seasoned military commander. He was no stranger to high-stakes battles and had previously faced formidable Native American forces. He understood the importance of gathering intelligence before committing to an attack and recognized that charging into an unknown situation without reconnaissance could be disastrous. From this perspective, Custer's decision to approach Ford B was likely a calculated effort to assess the strength of the village and the disposition of its defenders. As he stood atop the bluffs overlooking the river, he would have seen the vast expanse of the encampment before him. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors ready to fight. What he saw in those moments, and how he interpreted the unfolding situation, ultimately shaped his next fateful decisions, ones that would lead to the destruction of his command and secure his place in one of the most debated battles in American history. Custer's approach to Ford B, strategy or miscalculation? From his elevated position above the Little Bighorn Valley, Custer could see dust clouds rising from below, an unmistakable sign of movement among the thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors and their families. Yet, despite this vantage point, the true scale of the force arrayed against him remained obscured. The riverbanks and undulating bluffs obstructed his line of sight, preventing him from fully grasping the size and disposition of the village. The chaotic motion of figures below, some appearing to flee while others gathered in formation, only deepened the uncertainty. Were they non-combatants escaping the impending battle or warriors maneuvering for an attack? This ambiguity likely led Custer to approach Ford B with measured caution rather than immediate aggression. The testimonies of Native American warriors who observed Custer's movements provide critical insight into his tactical thinking. Standing Bear, a Mini-Conju Lakota warrior, recalled that Custer descended from the ridge but made no attempt to cross the river, reinforcing the notion that his actions were more reconnaissance-driven than offensive. If Custer had been probing the village's defenses, he was likely assessing whether an assault was feasible rather than preparing for an outright attack. The relatively light resistance he encountered at Ford B likely influenced his next move. Rather than committing his forces in an uncertain engagement, Custer opted to continue northward, searching for higher ground from which to survey the battlefield. His position at this moment was precarious. His command was stretched thin across the ridges behind him, and only a portion of his troops had reached the bluffs overlooking the river. The rest of his men were still navigating the rugged terrain, making a coordinated assault nearly impossible. Given these conditions, an attack at this stage would have been reckless. Instead, Custer may have viewed Ford B as an opportunity to gather intelligence rather than a launching point for an immediate strike. The challenges of battle, horses, terrain, and organization. Another crucial factor in Custer's decision-making at Ford B was the condition of his cavalry. Military reports indicate that the horses in his command were agitated and difficult to control, an issue that complicated efforts to organize a charge across the river. In his later writings, Godfrey described the confusion among Custer's ranks, noting that the restless horses contributed to the overall disarray of the force. Given these logistical challenges, it seems increasingly likely that Custer viewed his stop at Ford B as a necessary reconnaissance effort rather than a preparatory position for an assault. After roughly 10 minutes assessing the situation, Custer decided to move northward. His exact objective remains debated. Some historians suggest he was searching for a better vantage point from which to observe the village, while others theorize that he intended to reunite with the rest of his command. Regardless of his ultimate goal, eyewitness accounts and battlefield reconstructions indicate that Custer departed from Ford B between 3 o'clock and 3:05 p.m., heading toward the ridges that overlooked Medicine Tail Coulee. One of the defining aspects of Custer's strategy during this phase of the battle was his use of reconnaissance by force, a tactic intended to draw the enemy into revealing their numbers and positions. Rather than launching a full-scale attack, he may have hoped to provoke the warriors into engagement on ground more favorable to his troops. By advancing northward, Custer might have been attempting to give the illusion of a larger force maneuvering into position, thereby baiting the warriors into combat on his terms rather than theirs. The encroaching threat and Keogh's defensive action, however, as Custer moved away from Ford B, he faced a growing threat. Reports indicate that approximately 50 mounted warriors, led by the Cheyenne war leaders Wolf Tooth and Bigfoot, were advancing toward his rear. If left unchecked, this force posed a significant danger, threatening to sever Custer's link with the rest of his command and cutting off any potential retreat. Recognizing the severity of the situation, Captain Miles Keogh ordered his men to fire upon the advancing warriors, creating a protective buffer that allowed Custer to continue his movement northward. While withdrawing from Ford B carried risks, it was a calculated move. By heading toward higher ground, Custer aimed to gain a better understanding of the battlefield while also maintaining a defensive position against the warriors amassing along the eastern ridges. This maneuver suggests that his priority was not an immediate engagement, but rather securing an advantageous position from which to dictate the battle's terms. Debunking the myth of an assault at Ford B. One of the most enduring misconceptions surrounding Custer's actions at Ford B is the belief that he intended to launch an assault on the village from this location. However, the available evidence overwhelmingly contradicts this theory. The timeline of events, the limited resistance encountered at the ford, and the scattered positioning of Custer's forces all point to the conclusion that his primary goal was reconnaissance. Executing an attack from Ford B would have presented immense logistical challenges. More than half of Custer's command was still trailing behind him, struggling through uneven terrain, and the village itself was partially obscured by dust and natural obstructions. He lacked both the manpower and the situational clarity necessary for an effective assault. Furthermore, the relatively weak opposition from native warriors at Ford B suggests that they did not perceive Custer's presence there as an imminent threat. If he had been preparing for a direct attack, it is likely that the village's defenders would have responded with greater urgency and force. In sum, the notion that Custer planned to cross the river and launch an assault from Ford B is not supported by historical evidence. Instead, his actions at the ford align with a reconnaissance mission, an effort to assess the strength of the native forces and determine the best course of action. His subsequent decision to move northward was likely driven by the need to find better ground from which to evaluate the situation and coordinate his forces. The strategic dilemma, Custer's final movements as the battle continued to unfold, the period between Custer's arrival at Ford B and his departure. Northward remains one of the most scrutinized and debated aspects of the engagement. The precise timing of these events is crucial to understanding his decision-making process. Was his northward movement simply a reaction to the growing native forces nearby, or was it part of a broader strategic plan? According to the most reliable battlefield reconstructions, Custer reached the bluffs above Ford B at approximately 2:55 p.m. This moment marked a turning point. He and his men could now see the village more clearly, though much of it remained obscured by dust and terrain. After spending roughly 10 minutes assessing the situation, Custer began his northward movement around 3:05 p.m., leaving Ford B behind in search of a more defensible and informative position. By 3:07 p.m., just minutes after Custer began his northward movement, Captain Keogh ordered his men to fire upon the advancing native forces, buying time for Custer to reposition his command. This response highlights the precarious nature of Custer's situation. His forces were being shadowed by enemy warriors, and his ability to dictate the battle's tempo was slipping away. The role of Ford B, Reconnaissance, not assault. The significance of Ford B in the Battle of the Little Bighorn has been the subject of extensive debate. Was it simply a waypoint in Custer's reconnaissance efforts, or was it meant to serve as a critical crossing point for an eventual attack? The timeline of events strongly supports the former. Custer's time at Ford B was brief, lasting only about 10 minutes, and during this period, there is no evidence to suggest he attempted to cross the river or engage in a major battle. His actions at Ford B appear to have been focused on gathering intelligence about the village and the positioning of enemy forces. Eyewitness accounts from native warriors further reinforce this interpretation. Shave Elk, an Oglala warrior, recalled seeing Custer's column approaching the river but stopping short of making a full assault. His account describes a brief skirmish rather than a serious attempt to cross the river. Similarly, the limited resistance encountered at the ford suggests that Custer did not consider it a primary objective. A crucial aspect of Custer's approach to battle was his use of reconnaissance by force, a tactic in which a small detachment engages the enemy to provoke a reaction and reveal their strength. Rather than committing to an all-out attack, Custer likely hoped to lure warriors out of the village, forcing them into a battle on more favorable terrain. As he moved northward, he may have sought to create the illusion of a larger force advancing, further baiting the native warriors into engaging on his terms. Yet, as history would prove, the battle was no longer in Custer's control. His reconnaissance efforts at Ford B would soon give way to a brutal and decisive confrontation, one that would seal the fate of his command and cement his place in history. Custer's tactical maneuvers, strategy, or fatal miscalculation. As Custer's command advanced along the ridges, they remained in full view of the warriors in the village, a calculated move that may have been intended to draw more native forces into the open. This maneuver would have allowed Custer to gather critical intelligence about the size and positioning of the opposing forces, while avoiding an immediate confrontation. The testimony of two eagles, a Kolwakasa Brule Sioux warrior, offers valuable insight into this phase of the battle. Two eagles described Custer's men as mounted and moving down the ridges toward Ford B, yet he made no mention of a significant engagement at the crossing. This omission suggests that Custer's movements were driven by reconnaissance rather than an attempt to capture the village. Two Eagles' account aligns with the theory that Custer was using the ridges as vantage points to observe the village and gauge the enemy's strength rather than launching an immediate assault. As Custer's command continued northward, the danger from the east escalated. A contingent of approximately 50 mounted warriors, led by the Cheyenne war leaders Wolf Tooth and Bigfoot, was advancing toward Custer's rear. This development posed a significant tactical challenge. If these warriors managed to cut off Custer's escape route, his command could be trapped and overwhelmed. Recognizing the threat, Captain Miles Keogh ordered his men to fire on the approaching warriors, providing crucial covering fire that allowed Custer to maintain his northward movement. The presence of these warriors on Custer's flank underscores the precariousness of his position. While he remained focused on gathering intelligence about the village and assessing the strength of the native forces, the encroaching warriors from the east were tightening the noose around his command. Had Wolf Tooth and Bigfoot's warriors managed to flank Custer's column unchecked, it could have resulted in the swift collapse of his forces. Keogh's decisive leadership and the disciplined fire of his troopers likely prevented such a disaster, allowing Custer to continue his reconnaissance while keeping the initiative. The role of skirmishers in Custer's defense, a crucial component of Custer's tactical approach during this phase, was the deployment of skirmishers to protect his flanks. As Custer's command moved northward, Lieutenant Algernon Smith and his Gray Horse Troop were assigned to provide flank security. Smith's men formed a skirmish line, dismounted, and prepared to repel any native forces that attempted to engage Custer's column. The use of skirmishers allowed Custer to maintain a defensive posture while continuing his reconnaissance. By positioning Smith's men as a protective screen, Custer ensured that his column would not be caught off guard by an enemy ambush. The effectiveness of Smith's skirmishers is reflected in the accounts of native warriors who witnessed the battle. Brave Wolf, a Northern Cheyenne warrior, described how Custer's soldiers deployed and advanced toward the river, suggesting that Smith's men were actively engaged in shielding Custer's column from enemy forces. This defensive maneuvering provided Custer with the necessary flexibility to continue his reconnaissance without fully committing to an engagement. By 3:07 p.m., Custer's command had moved beyond Fort B and was advancing toward Calhoun Hill. This position offered multiple advantages. It provided a clear vantage point from which Custer could observe the village, while also serving as a more defensible position in the event of an attack. The decision to move to Calhoun Hill, Custer's decision to shift his position to Calhoun Hill, was likely influenced by several strategic factors. First, the dust and confusion at Fort B had limited his ability to assess the full extent of the native forces, making it imperative to find a better observation point. Second, with the threat from the east increasing, Custer needed a strong defensive position where he could consolidate his scattered command. Lastly, Calhoun Hill allowed Custer to maintain the flexibility of movement without immediately engaging in battle. Historians have often debated whether Custer's movements during this phase were reckless or strategically sound. While his decision to push northward has been criticized, the timeline of events suggests that he was making calculated choices based on the information available to him. His use of high ground, deployment of skirmishers, and reliance on reconnaissance by force indicate a leader attempting to gather intelligence and avoid premature engagement. The encircling forces and the collapse of Custer's command as Custer's command moved toward Calhoun Hill, the battle entered its final and most decisive phase. The coordination of native forces, which had been developing throughout the engagement, now began to take full effect. Warriors led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other prominent leaders were converging from multiple directions, surrounding Custer's command. The long-debated question of whether Custer's northward movement was a tactical retreat or a continuation of his reconnaissance remains unresolved. Some historians argue that Custer was attempting to link up with Major Reno's battered forces, while others believe he was searching for a better position from which to launch an attack. What is indisputable, however, is that by the time Custer reached Calhoun Hill, he was no longer in control of the battle. Surrounded and outnumbered, Custer's command faced a relentless assault. The open terrain provided little cover, forcing his men to fight in small, disorganized clusters. Despite the overwhelming odds, Custer's officers attempted to maintain order and mount a defense. Lieutenant Algernon Smith's Gray Horse Troop, which had been so effective earlier in the engagement, now found itself fighting for survival. The final stand, a slow, desperate collapse, the final moments of the battle were marked by fierce, close-quarters combat. Native accounts provide vivid descriptions of the soldiers attempting to form defensive positions, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer number of warriors attacking from all sides. White Shield, a Northern Cheyenne warrior, recalled seeing the soldiers dismount and deploy skirmishers in an attempt to hold off the advancing warriors. However, the native forces continued to press forward relentlessly. Brave Wolf, another Northern Cheyenne warrior, described how Custer's men initially resisted with determination but were gradually forced to retreat. His account suggests that Custer attempted to rally his troops, but the sheer force of the attack made communication and coordination nearly impossible. One of the most compelling native testimonies comes from Pretty White Buffalo, a Hunkpapa Lakota woman who arrived at the battlefield as the fighting reached its climax. She recalled witnessing the soldiers dismount and deploy into skirmish lines as they tried to defend themselves. However, as she described, the withering fire from the native warriors quickly decimated their ranks, leaving them with no avenue for escape. By 4 p.m., Custer's command was effectively cut off. With no reinforcements in sight and his forces stretched thin, the battle turned into a brutal struggle for survival. Lieutenant Miles Keogh and his men made a final effort to hold their position, but they too were eventually overwhelmed. The legacy of Custer's last stand, the myth of Custer's last stand, has often been romanticized, portraying the battle as a noble but doomed defense against insurmountable odds. In reality, the final phase of the engagement was a chaotic and desperate series of skirmishes. The placement of the fallen soldiers on the battlefield tells a grim story, not of a cohesive defensive stand, but of small groups fighting and dying in isolation. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the battle's aftermath is the stark disparity in casualties. While the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors suffered losses, their numbers were far fewer than those of Custer's command. This speaks to the tactical advantage held by the native forces, who expertly used the terrain to their benefit and executed coordinated attacks against a vastly outmatched enemy. The exact moment of Custer's death remains one of the great mysteries of the battle. Some accounts suggest he fell early in the fighting, while others claim he continued issuing orders until the very end. Regardless, by the time the sun set on June 25, 1876, Custer's entire command had been annihilated, a devastating and decisive victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and a moment that would forever shape the narrative of the American West. Custer's final moments and the enduring legacy of Little Bighorn. By the time the battle had ended, Custer's body was discovered among a small group of soldiers atop what would come to be known as Custer Hill. He had not attempted to flee, nor had he been taken captive. Instead, he perished fighting alongside his men in one of the most infamous defeats in American military history. Custer's death, like much of the battle itself, has been heavily mythologized. Some accounts depict him as a tragic hero, a valiant leader making a final stand against overwhelming odds. Others characterize him as a reckless and overconfident commander whose miscalculations led to the annihilation of his command. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. Custer was an experienced and capable officer, yet he severely underestimated both the size and the tactical prowess of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces. His decisions on the battlefield were influenced by the chaotic, fast-moving nature of the engagement, were clear. Information was scarce, and the situation evolved rapidly beyond his control. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains one of the most scrutinized and debated engagements in American history. While Custer's defeat was a military catastrophe, its repercussions extended far beyond the battlefield. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, it was a moment of triumph, one of the few instances in which native forces decisively repelled the U.S. Army. Yet this victory was short-lived. The battle marked a turning point in the United States government's campaign to subdue the Plains tribes. The shock of Custer's defeat galvanized public opinion, leading to an intensified military response that would ultimately culminate in the forced subjugation of the very warriors who had won the day at Little Bighorn. For Custer, the battle was both his finest and most ruinous hour. His name became inextricably linked with the last stand, a symbol of both frontier heroism and the tragic consequences of miscalculation. His movements at Ford B, Calhoun Hill, and beyond were shaped by the tactical realities he faced, an effort to gather intelligence, secure defensible ground, and maneuver against a determined enemy that outmatched him in numbers and strategy. Even today, Custer's legacy remains deeply polarizing. To some, he is the embodiment of bold military leadership. To others, he is a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by prudence. Yet regardless of perspective, his story remains an essential chapter in the larger narrative of the American West, one that continues to capture the imagination of historians, scholars, and the public alike.